Hello dear friends, I'm Albert Einstein. Welcome once again to Historical Impact, Private Lives. We thank you for dedicating this important time of your life to seeing and hearing us. We promise not to disappoint you. Just join us until the end of this episode. We guarantee it will be something enjoyable for you. Today we will talk about forbidden loves and weddings in Gretna Green, Scotland. Some of you may be wondering, what is Gretna Green? Well, we'll see. To begin with, let's place ourselves in mid-18th century England. At that time and in that place, the parents of young women from the nobility had a great concern. Mariner marriages existed and were widespread. It happened that many young noblewomen fell in love with sailors and married them just days after meeting them and without parental authorization, as was customary at that time. The sailors of the time, not necessarily those of this era, who no longer lived the lives of those sailors, were attributed a seductive capacity that later became classic, both in literature and in reality. These marriages were facilitated, to use a euphemism, by priests of bad reputation, but beyond the bad reputation of the priest, the consecrated unions became indissoluble. So the sailors, and later any interested man, led their beloved to the discreet chapels of those clergymen, and there the ceremony took place. After this, the new couple chose to escape. The so-called colonies of the empires of the time were places where opportunities were offered for these couples to escape. Hundreds of sailors, with their noble ladies, ended up in South Africa or Australia, for example. You are probably thinking, what concern or problem does this have in this era in which you live, where anyone marries anyone, or doesn't marry? But in the 18th century, it was a matter of importance. In the year 1753, the members of the English Parliament decided to do something to prevent these marriages. A rule proposed by Sir Ralph Jenrick was approved. This rule ordered the following: those who want to marry in England, in order to do so, must publish their intentions during the 3 Sundays preceding the date of marriage. This publication, which was nothing more nor less than a note placed on the door of the church in their community, aimed to prevent secret unions. The disclosure of the upcoming marriage was intended for the bride's parents to have the opportunity to give or withhold consent for their daughter's wedding. Additionally, with this measure, the nobility tightly closed their ranks to all the unprivileged who announced their intention to marry someone of a higher class than theirs. That obligation imposed by Parliament had its flaw: it was not valid in Scotland, and the consequences of this were quite curious. Couples of lovers who faced parental or social prohibition to marry could make a swift escape to a place called Gretna Green, a Scottish town near the English border. In that place, for 2 centuries, there was an intense matrimonial traffic. Gretna Green became a scandalous place for that era. During the early years of its existence, only people with money could afford to celebrate weddings there, because it was very burdensome for the time. For the man to take his lady there, it was necessary to have numerous relays on the way, offer tips to various emerging figures. There were many tolls to pay. We'll tell an anecdote that exemplifies these difficulties. Lord Westmoreland, a nobleman who at that time was down on his luck, fell in love with the daughter of the banker's shelter, and the two eloped to Gretna Green in 1782. The lord and the banker's heiress set off in a carriage pulled by 4 horses and made a wisely organized chain of relays. They needed to leave behind the girl's father, the banker's shelter, who upon learning of the elopement decided to go in search of his daughter. In a town called Shap, in England, Lord Westmoreland took the precaution of ordering that no horse leave the district on the day following their departure. This involved Lord Westmoreland distributing money among all the horse owners in the village, asking them not to rent out any horses on those days, anticipating that the father of his future wife might immediately set out in search of them. The detail was that when the powerful banker's shelter distributed even more money, he was able to continue the pursuit. It all ended when, on the verge of reaching the border, Lord Westmoreland shot one of the horses brought by the banker's shelter, and the banker's carriage overturned. That's when the lovers could finally reach Gretna Green and get married. The ceremony in that place was quite strange. The most famous priests were John Paisley and Robert Elliot. Paisley was an obese man around 70 years old, and besides being a clergyman, he was a tobacco vendor, drunk, and miserable. That's what the chronicles of the time said. We don't know if this was on his business card. Those priests of Gretna Green charged for their services and did so according to the instructions of the coachman who brought the couples who arrived as runaways. Depending on the appearance of the lovers or what they had talked about during the journey, the coachman advised Paisley and Elliot on the fee they should charge for performing the wedding. Once this aspect was resolved, the ceremony was carried out following the liturgical celebration of the Church of England, in the presence of 2 witnesses, who also had to be hired by the bride and groom, and by that point, most of the inhabitants of Gretna Green engaged in this activity of being witnesses, as a means of subsistence. Being wedding witnesses was a profession in that place. Paisley and Elliot had a bridal chamber, that is, a special room, for the use of the newlyweds. The reason for having that bridal chamber was so that the consummation of the marriage would prevent possible annulments. So after the wedding, immediately, the newlyweds went to the bridal chamber that the priests already had prepared. It is to be supposed that those encounters were probably far from any passion. It was more of a nervous, quick procedure, and for that reason, most of the time, difficult. "Hurry up, your dad is coming," the new husband would say. Or, "Leave the bottle of wine for 5 minutes," the new wife would say. The chronicles of the time recount that on more than one occasion, enraged parents would unexpectedly burst into the bridal chamber rented with full service by the priests Paisley and Elliot. According to these chronicles of the time, more than one father executed the seducer of his daughter at the precise moment of their consummating their marriage. The newlyweds, after the wedding celebrated without surprises, could return to their villages without any fear because, even if the parents of the new wives dripped with hatred, the unions celebrated were recognized as valid. And they had to be respected. There was, at some point, an indignant father who suggested putting a guard on the road dedicated to intercepting the lovers. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was said that in Gretna Green, bigamy, bastardy, and ruinous marriages flourished. Sir James Graham, in the House of Commons, said that there were many men who reached Gretna Green with the sole purpose of joining, carnally, with the women they desired. The truth is that it is imaginable that someone willing to take so many risks and invest sums of money for this purpose, perhaps being able to resolve this in a closer place, would seem absurd. But that was talked about at the time. These details heard in this era seem more than absurd, as if they were stories from the moon. But in that era, the girls put up as a barrier to accessing the passing intentions that the courting man might have, the fact of not being united by marriage before the love encounter. Perhaps they would say, "Ah, if you don't marry me, I won't let you touch me again." The shoulder, for example. Those who aspired to be with a woman they desired, in this situation, accepted marriage, and once their lust was satisfied, they abandoned their wife. You might say, what a scoundrel. The truth is that, probably, today it is not very different in that aspect. Both some, without the need to marry, demonstrate all their charms, their sensitivity, their active listening, their fair word, their captivating tone, with some specific purpose that occasionally benefits or suits them. But perhaps if this extends over time and involves reaching for a glass of water on a night of toothache, or hanging out freshly washed clothes, perhaps the interest and charms fade away. Returning to Sir James Graham, and not to attribute to him a completely absurd idea about the efforts to reach Gretna Green by some prospective husbands. He arrived at this conclusion by detecting that some men of the time were recorded as having married in Gretna Green 20 or even 30 times. Finally, it happened that marital customs loosened in England and throughout the world. And this led to the shine of Gretna Green fading away. However, impatient lovers or dowry seekers did not stop existing, who went there to evade opposing parents. It was not until 1939 that marriages celebrated in Gretna Green were completely abolished. This story speaks to us of difficulties that today may seem totally strange to us. I was thinking about utopias, this to reflect with you, dear friends. As a definition, a utopia does not necessarily have to be possible. On the contrary, more than something achievable, it should be a behavior that points out a path, a trend. The point is that, many times, something that seemed utopian in 1753, for example, when this story we have just shared began, nowadays it is not. There was a time when, for example, asphalt and hygiene were utopian things. But the facts of history have shown that they surpassed those utopias. But, perhaps, in some cases, history passed over some facts, and we haven't even realized it yet. And we are marching behind things that have been left behind. And we resist without even realizing it. Perhaps what needs to be done, if anything needs to be done, is to change utopia. Simply change utopia. There are forks in history, moments when it seemed dominated and predictable. That is to say, what seemed like a causal series is interrupted by some random issues, even by some cataclysms, by some revolutions, and we're not saying this from a political point of view, but merely from the human condition. It is then that humans, perhaps, have no choice but to readjust, to undergo a process of adaptation. For example, from being a society where people not only think about consumption and the value of owning objects as a way to access a happy life, to being a society where simple but truly important things are valued. Such as moments with the people we say we love, having conversations that fill our souls with hope, ideas, or simply moments to take a break on the road and maybe, just maybe, realize or see what we don't realize or see. These stories, like those of Gretna Green, may seem distant in time, and even foreign to our reality. But perhaps they can serve as a springboard for reflection. How much of what is an irreversible paradigm today may not be? How much of what seems lamentable today could become an enriching experience? How much of what seems bad today could only be the process of generating a higher value for our lives? At Historical Impact, Private Lives, we share historical facts. But it's not just about storytelling, it's about trying to generate additional value to this content. We have no pretensions of changing anyone's life by watching our content. But perhaps our content can be a gentle breeze that renews that wonderful spring that each of you carries within yourselves. Finally, once again, we appeal to your generosity to subscribe to this channel. You know that you help us a lot to continue generating content. We think of you. Not in our vanity of having a super channel, or being the best at anything. Only in the value of simplicity, that the precious time of your life that you dedicate to listening to us and watching us, has its humble reward. Albert Einstein tells you this.